Well, happy Sabbath day. As you can hear from the scriptures, there's a pretty strong theme there that we're to take this day of rest in God and maybe consider what that's about and how that works for us. A day of rest in God. Sounds good, at least at the up front. And yet I wonder. There is a lot of pressures and demands out there, isn't there, for us to do stuff, to keep going, to work hard, to accomplish things, to be productive, to carry the load that we're supposed to carry and keep going with that. And it's kind of hard to quit. Doing nothing is tough for you, I bet, when you've had to do it. Maybe you've been sick sometime and had to do nothing for a while, and it's just this part of us just has to do something, and we get anxious and feel like we got to go and do. So I don't think it's so easy always to rest in God. Maybe that's why it got included in the top 10 Commandments, right? To take a Sabbath day of rest, the command. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Holy means, the root word of that means set apart for special use. That this time would be set apart for rest in God, a special use like that. So to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So we have it there. And in fact, it even goes back before that. If you look in the very first verses of our Bible, that God rested on the seventh day. For the Jewish people in Jesus' day, they even had maybe a stronger motivation, a scary motivation for them to remember the Sabbath day. If you remember, some 100 years before Jesus' time, they were defeated by the big, strong power called Babylon. Their country was largely leveled. Jerusalem was leveled. The temple God lived in leveled. Most of the people were killed. And the remnant, the best of their people, was hauled off as slaves and servants for almost 70 years in Babylon. It was a devastating thing. And the prophets foretold it, saying, you're not obeying God's law, God's covenant, part of which is remember the Sabbath day. So when they got back in the land and they got back on their feet and they started rebuilding, they had this in the back of their head, and you can understand where it comes from. We're not going to let this happen again. If God's punished us because we aren't doing the law, we're going to get really good at this. In fact, we're going to make all these details of how we're going to follow the law so that it never happens again, that God would be so angry with us, disappointed in us, that he would allow us to be destroyed. And so by the time Jesus got there, there was this group called the Pharisees. And they were kind of the enforcers of this, the political leaders of this movement to get the Sabbath day right. And so when Jesus' disciples are walking through the grain fields, they're picking grain, they're rubbing it in their hands, get the husks off, right, and then eating it. On the Sabbath day, that's harvesting. That's what that is. That's called harvesting. And that's on that list of things you're not supposed to do. But I don't know if you've ever done that, to gone out in the fields, husked up a bunch of grain. You know you're hungry if you're doing this. This is not you're doing this because this is fun. You are hungry if you're eating raw grain right off the plant in the field. And of course, they challenged Jesus on it. As they say, they called him out on this one. Jesus, they're doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath day. And well, Jesus' first response was pretty straightforward. He said, well, do you remember old King David? You know, David, that's their hero. Okay, you remember this guy? Of course they do. Someone they hold on this super high pedestal, David. How he went to the temple. Now, if you think Sabbath rules are tight, temple rules are even higher, okay? That's a bigger deal yet. And he ate the bed of presents that was only to be for priests. You don't mess with the stuff of God in the house of God. So what's he getting at? He's saying, even your hero made an exception to the law because he was hungry. Why isn't it because my disciples are hungry that it's wrong for them to have an exception here? He's challenging their legalism. He's challenging how tight they were, how controlling they were around the Sabbath day. He's challenging them. And then he goes and says this kind of really, I think, strange words, odd words to us. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And we look at that and go, okay, what's he getting at? Well, one of the things Jesus does, he kind of uses a strange way of talking about himself in the third person. He calls himself often, we'll see, the Son of Man. And it's a really a vague term. It's hard to say what he's getting at exactly with that. And that may be exactly his point. He doesn't want them to really get it. But he calls himself the Son of Man, and he says he's Lord or Master, has charge of, the one with authority over the Sabbath, the day of rest in God. So he's saying, I am the one who is in charge, has authority over your lives on this day of rest in God. Okay, where are we going with this? Well, let's think about the idea of law a little bit. Now, law often is, at its best, is to help us in society. It's to protect you from bad things happening to you. It's to guide you in behavior as a common people so that we get along together. Law is to serve us well. That's the hope of law. But what often happens with law, of course, is it begins to become a tool for those in power to get their way. And you see that all across the globe where, say, just a blatant, terrible case of this is in some countries, they make laws to disqualify people that they don't like for running for office. That is a blatant attempt to keep the power, to not be challenged by someone else. So we'll just make a law that keeps us going and it keeps us in power. So law is often used by those in power to keep them in power. So when Jesus says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, if you'd ask people in Jesus' day who was the Lord of the Sabbath, well, God made the Sabbath law. But beneath that, the ones who had charge of that were the Pharisees, where Jesus was. They were kind of the lords of the Sabbath. So, Jesus is in their face saying, you guys, you think you're in charge? He's saying, I'm in charge of this stuff. You aren't. That's a pretty big deal. If you're in America and you're talking to a judge and say, Judge, you think you are in charge of interpreting this law, and say, well, no, Judge, I'm the one interpreting the charge of this law. They're going to look at you like, oh, we got a problem here. And they're going to do something about it. Well, in that day, Jesus, that's what these guys do. No wonder they go out and think, we got to get rid of this guy. It's less about what's right and wrong here all of a sudden, and much more about, he's threatening our understandings, our systems, our understanding of the law. He is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, for us in our day, of course, we're very different in the sense of keeping the Sabbath day. We're not all bound up and worried about whether we should do this thing or that thing, really tight about what we can do and not do on the Sabbath day. In fact, we're on the other end, aren't we? Well, maybe I should take some rest, but maybe not. It's just very permissive, if you will. Instead of strict, we're kind of on the permissive side of that. We'll do, there's not much you can think of you wouldn't do on the Sabbath day, I imagine. If we have some time to rest, maybe we'll do that. But in general, we're pretty permissive on that thing. So on that level, we're in very different places. But I think something we have in common is, like the people in Jesus' day, we forget who is Lord of the Sabbath. I think we forget and lose track that this Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, and that maybe it isn't all that we can do what we want, when we want, however, and it doesn't matter. That's kind of where we go a little bit, isn't it? That we're in charge of our lives, we can do as we please. That means we're lords of our lives and our Sabbath, and just Jesus is kind of asserting himself, I think, today for us to remind us, you're not. I am. I am. I am Lord of your Sabbath. And there's a part of us that goes back and kind of fights that, I think. And we remember those first words I saw it started with about how, we have this sense that, well, we've got stuff to do. And maybe you do. I gotta get going on this. I feel this weight. I gotta take care of that. I'm being measured over here. My life is being judged by the accomplishments I make. We can hear all those cultural forces coming in on us, and we can feel the weight of all that stuff. But isn't that the very point? How many of us don't feel rested? How many of us feel burdened? How many of us feel drained because we go, do, and we can't stop? And when we do stop, we have no clue of what to do with it because it just keeps coming up inside of us or from outside of us, some voices. We feel the pressure, especially in this time, I think. This time of our political life in this country where we're so polarized. The tensions are in our society, so all the more. I think there's this call for us to remember there's this day of rest in God for you. This day of rest, where it's not just you as an individual, let's not make this an individual thing, but we together, this community that calls itself Ascension with other communities around the world, say, there's this time that we need to stop all this for a bit. And we're going to do it better together. It's a synod theme out there, if you haven't recognized that. Or church-wide goes, better together. But there's truth to that in support with each other, when we know that all of us are saying this is important and we can do this together, somehow we're going to be better when we do it together. Yeah. We will find our way to some sense of this rest of stopping, slowing down. And it's not saying that we're going to get all the way there, and yes, I know those of you who have jobs and things, you're going to have to find your way to do it, but the point is the rest in God. I work on the Sabbath day. I got to pick a different day. Just say it. So we can find our way to this rest in God. And the in God part, it's not just any rest, it's in God, and I want to say a few things about that. That's where Luther goes. Of course, in Luther's day, you remembered the Sabbath day. You didn't mess around on the Sabbath day. So he didn't really talk about the rest side so much, or the stopping side, but he talked about how we need to gladly hear and learn God's word. That was he said he's really helping him find it in God. That was his concern. There wasn't any rest. And you pick that up later in Luke's gospel with the famous story of Mary and Martha. And Jesus is visiting at their house. And Martha's running around doing all the stuff, taking care of the hostessing part of this deal. And Mary's sitting there at Jesus' feet. So Martha comes up to Jesus and complains. Look at my sister. She's not doing what she's supposed to be doing. And Jesus turns to her and says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and anxious about many things. But one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen the better portion. It isn't wrong that we do some stuff, you say, but there's a better portion at times, and God would have us embrace it. It's supposed to be a gift. A gift for us to be able to take this time and rest in God. To know that we're together, that somehow this world, it moves us from kind of, if you will, this sense of doing that we're so caught up in, to being. Just being. And when you break that over to this side of things, you see, I think some of the burden comes off. Because part of the burden of doing and going is everything's on my shoulders. Now, there are things on our shoulders. There are things we need to do. But when we get everything on there, it just is so weighty. It's so heavy. It's all about us, and we're in charge. Pretty soon, we are lords of everything, and we get the weight that comes from being the Lord of our lives. Because everything, if you're the Lord of your lives, depends on you. And Jesus say, no, I'm the Lord of all things. Not just the Sabbath. He'd add that, all things. And when you walk with me then, you have someone who's stronger than you are, who's bigger than the problems you face. That's what you get from being in God. This Lord is with you. Who's bigger than the problems you face, bigger than your health concerns, bigger than the conflicts, bigger than all the crazy stuff going on in the world. There is one greater than all those things. And when you stop doing and start being, there's a real relief that you're all right. That you're not finally in the end being measured by your accomplishments. You're being measured by love. And it helps you move away and find this crazy thing that you desperately need. A gift God would give you of rest in God. So this day we're gathered for that very thing. And as a part of that, hearing and learning God's word, getting the in God part, but also stopping and slowing down and being for a little bit. This God is greater than this stuff. I know it doesn't feel that way at times. It feels so crazy and out of control. But it's not when there's a Lord walking with you. So, take the gift. It's given this day. Rest in God. Rest in God.